We continue now at the top of Daf Ayin Vav Amid Beis Meseches Bava Basra. This is Bava Basra Daf 76b. On the previous Amud, the Gemara said that the Tanakam and the Brisa brought with Rabbi Nosson, that Tanakama follows the opinion of Rebbe. And the Gemara asks, how can you say the Tanakama follows the opinion of Rebbe? The Tanakama was saying that when it comes to a ship, the way to acquire a ship is through Mashicha, through pulling the ship. But Rebbe says that you can acquire the ship through Masira, through giving it over. Let's say the seller gives the buyer the rope that's attached to the ship. And the Brisa continues, this is the opinion of the Chachamim against Rebbe. The Chachamim say, Ad sheyim shecheni, you have to either pull the ship, or Ad sheyiskor es makom, or you have to rent out the area where the ship is. And the Rashbam says, Ad sheyim shecheni l'reshus hamiyuchad lo. You have to pull it into a reshus, into an area which is designated for the buyer. The idea of Mashiach is not simply to pull it, but it's to pull it into your reshus. And Ad sheyiskor, the other possibility is that you rent out the place, the reshuso shel adam konelo, because if it's in the person's chutzir or in his reshus, so to speak, that would be enough to create a kinyan. Kedanaf galon mevim himotze timotze biyado hageneva. And so if he would rent the area where the ship is, that would also create a kinyan. And so the question of the Gemara is, according to Rebbe, we see that Mesira is sufficient by a ship. You don't need Mashicha. And yet we said in the Brisa, the Tanakama said that you need Mashicha. And the Gemara answers, Lokash, it's not difficult. Kan b'Rishus Harabim, kan b'Simta. It depends if you're in a Rishus Harabim in a public area or in a Simta. Simta is like a semi-private area. And the idea is that if you're in a Rishus Harabim, so in such a situation, Mashicha is not going to be effective because you have to pull it into your Rishus. The buyer would have to pull it into his own Rishus. And therefore, in a Rishus Harabim, that's where Masira is going to be effective. That's what Rebbe was saying. But the Chachamim, the Tanakama rather, in the Brisa with Rabbi Nosson, the reason they mentioned Mashicha is because there we were talking about an area where Mashicha could be effective. It was talking about a semi-private or a private area. And the Rashbam explains, Lokash, it's not difficult. Hada Amar Rebbe, that which Rebbe says, Sfina b'Mesira, that when it comes to a ship, the way to acquire the ship is through giving it over. Hainu b'Rishus Harabim, that's talking if it's in a public area. Kagon Rakak Mayim she'Rishus Harabim. For example, let's say you have a pool of water in a public area. The Evshar b'Mashicha, there Mashicha is not possible. The Ein Mashicha ela kashemoshech l'Rishuso, because the idea of Mashicha is that he's pulling it into his Rishus. Kagon b'Chatzar shel Shnein, that could be in a Chatzar that they share. Let's say the buyer and the seller share a chutzner, or besimter, let's say it's a semi-private area, as we'll say later. So in a case where it's impossible to do Mashicha, then Masira is effective. And the Rashbam continues, and that which the Tanakama and the Brisa with Rabbi Nosson, which essentially is following the sheet of Rebbe, the Tanakama says Sfina b'Mashicha, says the ship is acquired with Mashicha, not with Masira. Hainu besimta, that's talking about in the semi-private area, meaning like in an alleyway. Kagon mevoos ketanim, for example, you have small alleyways, hapsuchin l'Rishus Harabim, which open up into Rishus Harabim. V'yesh bahen mayim, and let's say there's water over there, usfina omedes sham, and there's a ship over there. Tekevon de'enu Rishus Harabim mamish. So since that's not a real Rishus Harabim, ela dezimnin dedochki b'nei Rishus Harabim v'ayli l'hasam. Sometimes the people of Rishus Harabim overflow into there. V'yesh Rishus la'adam l'sheves sham, and a person can stay over there. Harehu b'Rishus kol mi she'omed sham liknos b'Mashicha. So now that's considered private enough that a person can acquire with Mashicha, ki'iluhu reshuso, as if it is his reshus. V'kevon de'efshar b'Mashicha, and the Rashbam explains, once it's possible to do a Mashicha, lav urcha desimta b'Masira. So now we say it's not the normal way to use Masira anymore, and Masira is not effective. That's essentially what's happening over here. What's happening is that Rebbe is saying, in a situation where you're in Rishus Harabim and Mashicha is impossible, then Masira works. But if you're in an area where Mashicha is possible, Masira will not work. V'lo mikniya b'Masira. Masira will not be effective for a kinyan. And that's why the Tanakama says Sfina b'Mashicha, that a ship is acquired with Mashicha, V'osios b'Masira, and osios, which again is letters, is documents, that's acquired through Masira, through giving over. Demajma, that implies Aval b'Sfina lo mikniya b'Masira. Sounds like the Tanakama is saying Masira does not work by a ship. The high kiyorche, because you have to follow whatever is the normal kinyan that is in this particular location. Rishus Harabim b'Masira, if you're in Rishus Harabim, Masira is effective. V'simta b'Mashicha, but if you're in a simta, Mashicha is effective, and you have to do the Mashicha, Kain Nira Be'enai. That appears to the Rashbam as the proper explanation of this Gemara. But the Gemara continues, B'mayu kimta laha basraisa b'rishus harabim. How can you say that this last brisa is talking about in Rishus harabim? Again, this last brisa is the brisa with Rebbe, where Rebbe says a person acquires a sfina, a ship, with Mesira. So we're saying that's in Rishus harabim, because in Rishus harabim, Meshicha is not possible, so Mesira is used for the kinyan. But let's look at the end of that brisa, what we just quoted above. The Chachamim say that you can only acquire the ship through Meshicha, and then they go on to say the other way to acquire the ship is if you rent that particular location. And so the Gemara says, V'ibra Rishus harabim. Now, if this brisa is talking about in a Rishus harabim, in a public domain, so miman oger. So first of all, when it comes to renting out the area where the ship is, who are you supposed to rent the area from? That's impossible if it's a Rishus harabim. V'su, and further, Meshicha b'Rishus harabim, mikanya. Is Meshicha going to work in Rishus harabim? It says, Ad sheyim shechena. How are you doing a Meshicha in Rishus harabim? V'Abaya v'Rava da'amri tarvayu. But Rabbi and Rava, they both said, Mesira kona b'Rishus harabim. Mesira can work in Rishus harabim, because again, over there, the seller is giving to the buyer. Let's say there's a rope attached to the ship. The seller is giving the buyer the rope. That can work in Rishus harabim. Uv'chatzer she'ena shel shneim, and that can work in a chatzer that doesn't belong to the two of them. But Meshicha, when it comes to Meshicha, when it comes to pulling it, as we said, it needs to be that he's pulling it into his Rishus. So there, kona besimta, there can be an acquisition, let's say in an alleyway, in a semi-private area. Uv'chatzer she shel shneim, or let's say the chatzer belongs to both of them, so then we can say that the buyer is pulling it into his own Rishus. V'hagba kona b'chol makom, and hagba, that works anywhere. And so the point over here is, it doesn't make sense to say that the last brisa is talking in Rishus harabim, because then how is Meshicha working? How are you renting the space? And so the Gemara answers, my ad sheyim shechena. What does the brisa mean? My ad sheyim shechena nami dekamar. What does the Chachamim mean in the brisa when they say that you do a Meshicha and that works on the ship? Umay ad sheyiskras mekoma dekamar. And what does it mean when the Chachamim say that you rent out the place? Hachi kamar. This is actually what the Chachamim are saying. Ad sheyim shechena mei Rishus harabim lisimta, until you pull it from the Rishus harabim to the simta, to the alleyway, to this semi-private area. V'im Rishus ba'ilami. And if we're talking about a situation where the area belongs to the seller, so then lo kanat sheyiskres makom, he's not going to acquire until he actually rents the location from the seller. That's actually what the Chachamim mean. They mean to say that it does need to be taken to a location where a kinyan can be effective. But the Gemara continues, Lema Abaya v'Rava da'amri karebi. Are we going to say that Abaya and Rava, that they say like Rebbe, meaning to say, Abaya and Rava said above, Mesira is kona b'Rishus harabim, that Mesira works in Rishus harabim. That's what Rebbe said, when the Sfina is in Rishus harabim, then you use a kinyan of Mesira. But the Chachamim seem to say that Mesira is not effective, that you need to actually do Meshicha and pull it into an area that is at least a semi-private area in order to do the Meshicha. But that would be strange to say that Abai and Rava follow Rebbe and not the Chachamim. And the Gemara answers, Amar Rav Ashi says, Ido Amar le lech chazeku kani. If the seller says to the buyer, go make a chazaka and acquire, so hachanami, so there actually everybody would agree that Mesira would work. Meaning the Chachamim really don't dispute Rebbe. When we're talking about a situation of Rishus harabim and the seller makes a general declaration to the buyer, go and acquire, so then he acquires through Mesira. But but here in this brisa where we had a machlokus between Rebbe and the Chachamim, whether Mesira works, the case is very specific. Diamar lech meshochu kani. The seller said to the buyer, go and do Meshicha and acquire. He actually said the word Meshicha. And the real machlokus between Rebbe and the Chachamim is, if he says the word Meshicha, are we assuming that he's makbid, that he's strict, that there has to be an actual Meshicha? Mar Savar Kapeda, one holds that he is actually strict about it. That's the Chachamim. When he says Meshicha, he means Meshicha. Umar Savar, but Rebbe says Mara Makum Hulo. He's just an indication. He's just saying a way that you can make the kinyan. But of course, if you would use another kinyan like Mesira, that would be effective. And the Rashbam explains Rabbanan Savri Kapeda. The Rabbanan say the person is being makbid. The seller is saying Lo Gamar Lahaknosu Elba Meshicha. The seller is saying I only want it to be a kinyan through Meshicha. Veloba Mesira, I don't want to use Mesira. Shem Yirtza Mocher Yuchal Lachzer Bo Kolzman Shalom Moshcha Zel Rishus. If the seller wants, he can retract on the sale as long as the buyer has not actually pulled it into his domain. But the other opinion, Rebbe says Mara Mokum, it's just an indication. If you want to do a Mashiach and take it immediately to your Rishus, go ahead and do it. But I'm giving it over to you in Mesira. Mesira is also a kinyan, and that's why Rebbe says Mesira would be effective, and the Chachamim say it is not. And the Gemara continues, Amar Papa says, if somebody is selling a shtar to his friend, the idea is he's selling the shtar that now the buyer is going to be able to collect the debt that is written up in the shtar. So he has to write from a document, meaning Rav Papa is saying Mesira alone is not enough. Rav Papa is following the Chachamim, you have to write it up in a document. Kanihu v'chol shibuda debei. You're acquiring the document and any lien that is written within the document. In other words, you're writing up a document of sale that says that I am giving you these documents, and you now have the ability, you now have the lien, you can collect the debts in this document. Amar Rav Ashi says, Amrisa l'shmaita kamid Rav Kahana. I said over this teaching of Rav Papa in front of Rav Kahana. V'amr Slain, I said to him, Time of the kosav lehachi. The only reason that the buyer acquires the ability to collect the debt is because this was written up in a shtar. Halo kosav lehachi lo kani. But if you didn't write this up, it would not be a good kinyan. Meaning Rav Ashi is following the opinion of Rebbe. Rav Ashi says Mesira alone should be enough. You shouldn't need a document. And the reason is, does he need it to tie around the mouth of his flask? Meaning to say, it should be obvious when you're giving over, when you're selling a document, you're not just selling the piece of paper, you're not using it as a stopper on a flask, you're acquiring the document because you want to acquire the debts that are within the document. So you shouldn't need to write up a document of sale, just giving it over. It should be obvious what the kinyan is for. But Amar Li, so Rav Kahana, Rav Ashi says that Rav Kahana said to me, in yes, lotzer v'lotzer, maybe that's what he is using it for. Maybe he's using it to tie around the mouth of the flask. That's why you need to write up the document. And the Rashbam explains, V'Omar Li said to me, in yes, lotzer v'lotzer, maybe that is the reason, it's to tie around the mouth of the flask. V'imi shom onah, now maybe you'll say that then there's a problem of onah, because the buyer is not paying the amount for a sheet of paper, he's paying the amount to actually be able to collect the debts. Yes or mishtus, you're going to say again that it's onah, because he's paying more than 6 more. Lahave bitul mekach, but that's actually true. We'll just say that the whole mekach, the whole sale, is nullified. Umachzer lo damav, and he has to return the money. V'zeh yachzer lo shtar chov, when the other one will return the document with the debt in it. And so therefore, yes, we do need to write it up and make it clear. Otherwise, maybe he's just buying the sheet of paper. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Ayin Zayin Amud Aleph.